Hello everyone and welcome back to Snook Nightmare. Stories 1. When I was 22, I started dating a guy named Dylan, whom I met on a dating app. We went out about 4 times over the span of a little more than a month. First, everything seemed fine. Our first date was a casual coffee meetup, lasting less than an hour. More of a screening process to ensure he seemed normal. Our second date was at a local bar, where we had a few drinks and got a little buzzed. It was fun. But on our third date, which was a dinner outing, I started having doubts. Something about his personality didn't sit right with me. I couldn't pinpoint what, but something felt slightly off. That date ended with a kiss, our first and only one. I convinced myself that since I let him kiss me, things must have been going okay. A couple of weeks later, we went on our fourth and final date. Once again, we met for drinks, but this time I wasn't as excited. I paid more attention to his little quirks and realized they were kind of unsettling. His mannerisms gave off antisocial, borderline creepy vibes. He was drinking too much, and he started getting way too touchy-feely, trying to kiss me multiple times. I'm not a fan of PDA, especially in a crowded bar, so I politely turned him down. After a few minutes, I mentioned I was tired, heavily implying we should leave. He asked for the check, paid, and we grabbed our coats. As we walked to our cars, he suddenly stopped me and bluntly asked if we could go home together. I said, "Not tonight. I have work tomorrow," which was a lie. He kept pushing, even saying he'd drive me to work the next day. Whether he was drunk or not, I found it absurd. I also wasn't comfortable with him drunk driving home. That night, as I drove home cautiously, since I had a couple of drinks, I noticed something strange. Car was following me. After making at least 3 different turns, I realized it was Dylan's car. I texted him, "Are you following me?" He responded quickly, "Yeah, I just want to make sure you get home okay." I called him, but he wouldn't pick up. This was really weird. I pulled over and texted him, "Stop following me. I'm fine." He hesitated in the middle of the street, probably reading my message, then finally drove off. I didn't hear from him again until I was already in bed. His message read, "Hope I didn't weird you out tonight. Sorry I got so drunk. Next time we should do something low-key, like dinner at my place." I didn't reply. The next morning he followed up, "Oh no, is the vibe dead?" I hesitated but decided to respond before things got worse. I texted, "Hey, I had a great time getting to know you, but I just don't think our personalities click. I also want to focus on myself right now. I hope you understand." That's when the angry messages started. The worst one read, "No, I don't understand. You strung me along for 4 dates just to say this? How about you pay me back for half of everything I bought for you?" Some of his other messages were even more personal and unsettling, so I blocked him. I thought that was the end of it, but then the no-caller ID phone calls started, one after another. I ignored them until eventually they stopped. The next day, when I got home from work, I found a bouquet of flowers and a card on my doorstep. The card was an apology from Dylan, asking for a second chance. That's when it hit me, he knew where I lived. Instead of finding it sweet, I was completely disturbed. I sent a final text telling him to never contact me again and that if he came near my house, I'd file for a restraining order. Then I blocked his number permanently. I thought I was finally safe, but I couldn't have been more wrong. One night, when I was home alone, I woke up to an odd noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but then I distinctly heard a door opening upstairs, one that led to the bedrooms. Nobody was supposed to be home that night. Fear gripped me. Intruder. I slid out of bed and crawled underneath it, clutching my phone as I dialed 911. As I whispered my emergency, I texted my family, "Who's home?" I heard distant noises, someone rummaging through another bedroom. Then my own bedroom door opened. Footsteps moved up the carpeted stairs leading to my loft bed. Then silence. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was almost worse than hearing him move. Then the drawers beside my bed started opening. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. A man's voice muttered under his breath. God damn it. Even in my fear, I recognized it. Dylan. I stayed frozen, praying my phone wouldn't buzz with a notification. I heard him rustling through my things. Then he sat down on my bed. I could see the outline of his shoes through the bed skirt. He stayed there, silent, for what felt like forever. Then, he muttered another curse under his breath. He closed my drawers, stood up, and walked downstairs. A moment later, the front door opened and shut. I stayed hidden for another 10 to 15 minutes until I heard a knock at the door. It was the police. I ran down and let them in. They did a full sweep of the house. They found that every window had been unlocked. The large dining room window in particular seemed to be his entry point. He must have squeezed through the bushes and climbed inside. I gave a full statement, including screenshots of his texts admitting he had followed me home. They took the case seriously, but without solid proof that it was him inside my house. Their hands were tied. Still, I was able to successfully file a restraining order against him. I was advised to never contact him again. He never showed up again after that, but for months, I felt like I was being watched. Even now, I sometimes worry he'll find out where I live. Stories 2. I was in 6th grade when this happened. It all started the week of Halloween. I had volunteered to stay after school and help set up a haunted house for our school's annual fall festival. The bonus? Free pizza for those who helped. Along with my friends, there was another kid who stayed late too. I'll call him Jake. He was funny and easy to get along with, so we never had any problems. Fast forward 2 weeks. Out of nowhere, a group of girls from my grade approached me, giggling and looking way too excited. Before I could ask, they blurted out that I had a secret admirer who would be messaging me that night. I won't lie, I was curious. I wanted to know who it was. Later that night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I got a notification on Messenger. It was the only app one had back then for keeping in touch with my parents when I was home alone. I unlocked my phone and saw the message was from Jake. That's when I remembered I had added him on Facebook during Halloween. The message read, "Ava, I need to talk to you." I immediately replied, concerned, "Yeah? What's up? Everything okay?" To this day, I regret ever responding. The typing bubbles lingered for what felt like forever. Then, finally, his message came through. A long paragraph. He confessed he had been in love with me since Halloween, saying I had been driving him crazy. He talked about how he had tried to impress me during recess with his soccer skills but felt like I never noticed. He ended with, "I want you to notice me. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, will you be my girlfriend?" I cringed. What the hell? I barely knew this kid, and I hadn't even talked to him much since Halloween. I wanted to let him down gently. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. So, I told him I just wanted to be friends. He didn't take it well. He kept asking why, pushing for a reason every time I answered. Eventually, he stopped responding. I thought that was the end of it. The next morning was a nightmare. Jake's friends kept coming up to me, saying he wanted to kiss me. Apparently, he had told the entire grade that he would do it, even if it meant cornering me. That was when I knew I had to tell someone. I went to my teacher, who advised me to stay inside during recess and lunch. She also told me that if Jake ever got too close, I should run straight back to the classroom. That wasn't enough for me. I reported him to the principal, who assured me they would handle it. That gave me a little bit of relief. I should mention, I lived right across the street from the school, and unfortunately, everyone knew it, including Jake. A few days later, I was walking home. I had barely been inside for 2 minutes when someone knocked on the front door. Curious, I peeked out the window, just in time to see someone duck behind a parked car. My stomach dropped. It had to be Jake. He must have followed me home. My mom opened the door to find a note addressed to me. I read it aloud. "There's a surprise for you under the Toyota in your driveway." At the time, the car belonged to my brother. My mom checked but found nothing. However, after that day, the car mysteriously stopped working. To this day, I have no idea what Jake did to it. My brother had to sell it. The harassment didn't stop. Every day, Jake's friends told me to give him a chance, saying he would treat me right. The worst part? One afternoon, as I was walking home, I heard the faint click of an iPhone camera behind me. I turned just in time to see Jake lowering his phone. Who knows how many pictures he had taken before I caught him. Every morning, I woke up to a message from him. "I can't wait to see you at school. I bet you'll look beautiful today." The stalking and harassment got worse, and knowing that he knew where I lived made it even scarier. Finally, I was called into the school counselor's office. I felt a sense of relief, thinking Jake was finally going to face consequences. Maybe even the police would be involved. But what the counselor told me was worse than anything I expected. "Boys will be boys," she said. "They do crazy things when they're in love." I just sat there, stunned. She continued, telling me I should feel flattered, that this was something all girls go through. She told me to accept it. At the time, I believed her. I didn't see how messed up that was. But looking back, it was one of the most disturbing things an adult had ever said to me. That afternoon, I told my mom everything. She was furious. That same week, she took me to the principal's office, where she confronted them. "What are you waiting for? Something bad to happen to her before you step in." The principal and counselor sat in silence. "Why is it taking so long for something to be done?" Still silence. My mom ended the conversation by threatening the counselor, telling her to never speak to me again unless she was present. Unfortunately, I don't think Jake ever got punished, and that still enrages me. He got away with everything, but it didn't even end there. One weekend, when my parents were out shopping, I was lying in bed, watching YouTube on my iPad. Then tap. I sat up, listening. Tap. I knew that sound. Something was hitting my second-floor window. First, I thought it was a bird, but then tap, tap, tap. My heart pounded. I got up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. Jake was standing outside, a handful of rocks in his palm, looking right at me. Somehow, he had figured out which window was mine. He was about to throw another when he noticed me watching. His lips moved, but I didn't stick around to see what he was saying. I ran downstairs, checked that every door and window was locked, and when I returned to my room, my phone lit up with 4 messages. "Why did you leave? I just want to talk. I'm sorry. All I wanted was a kiss. Please forgive me. You were not who I thought you were. Bye." I blocked him immediately. Thankfully, I never had another incident, even though I had to see him every day from 6th grade to senior year. The last thing I ever heard about Jake? He was arrested. For what? I have no idea. But the scariest part of all of this? That a grown woman, a school counselor, was completely comfortable telling a terrified 6th grade girl that harassment and stalking were compliments, that it was a learning experience. I hope she never works with kids again, and I hope I never see Jake again. Stories 3. I want to stay as anonymous as possible while sharing this. This experience gave me PTSD, and to this day, it haunts me. I've changed all the names and places to ensure no one can trace it back to me. I've always been a pretty reclusive person. Even in elementary school, Teachers told my parents I had antisocial behavioral problems. I was placed in these small 20-minute sessions for speech and behavior, but I never really understood why. As I got older, things didn't change much. Middle school was tough and high school was even worse. I wasn't bad at academics, just terrible at socializing. Despite my struggles, I managed to make a few close friends. But when it came to dating, that was a different story. To be honest, I lost my virginity at 21, which I always felt was kind of late. At 23, I was doing well. I had a stable, high-paying job and had even bought a townhouse in my hometown. It was nice, spacious, and impressive for someone my age. One night, I was swiping through Tinder when I matched with a girl. I'll call her Sophia. She was pretty and seemed fun, so we set up a date at a restaurant nearby. Throughout dinner, I felt like I was probably being awkward, and I left thinking she'd never want to see me again. But to my surprise, later that night, she texted me, saying she had a great time. I was ecstatic. Things moved quickly. By the fourth date, we were officially a couple. But as time passed, little things started to feel off. The excitement of getting a text or call from her started turning into dread. She would constantly check in on me, ask where I was, and get upset if I didn't respond fast enough. Then, one night, while we were on my couch, she demanded we share our locations with each other. I wasn't thrilled, but I had nothing to hide, so I agreed. That's when things really started spiraling. A few weeks later, I was hanging out at my friend Nate's house with our buddy Jake. It was a chill Friday night, just playing video games in the basement. Out of nowhere, Nate's mom walked downstairs, with Sophia following behind her. She was furious. In front of everyone, she started yelling at me, demanding to know why I was ignoring her texts instead of planning for some winery trip she wanted to go on. I asked if we could talk later, but she insisted I leave with her immediately. I apologized to my friends and walked outside with her. We argued on the street, and when she asked to come home with me, I refused. As soon as I got home, I texted her saying I needed space. Maybe I should have said it in person, but honestly, I was scared of how she'd react. That night, she blew up my phone with calls and messages. When I stopped responding, she showed up at my front door, pounding on it and ringing the doorbell over and over. My neighbor eventually came out and asked her what was going on, but instead of backing off, she screamed at him, calling me every name in the book. The next morning, I immediately stopped sharing my location with her. As if she had been obsessively checking, she texted me within minutes. Furious. That only solidified my decision. I sent one last text. Sophia, I'm sorry, but I have to block you for a while. You're scaring me. A week later, I was back at Nate's house hanging out. I left around 11 p.m. and got home a little after. Not tired yet, I made some food and sat down to watch a movie. That's when I heard something. A click or thud from the dining room. I muted the TV. The house was completely silent now. Then I heard it again. A door clicking open. Slowly, I crept toward the dining room. My stomach dropped. The door, one that I always kept shut, was slightly ajar. Someone was in my house. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and immediately called 911. I spoke loudly on the phone, hoping whoever was there would hear me. I think my ex-girlfriend broke into my house. Please send someone. The dispatcher told me to wait outside if possible. So I did. Within minutes, a police car rolled up. An officer and I searched every inch of my townhouse. Closets, the attic, even under the beds. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No sign of her. I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid. Maybe the door had moved on its own somehow. I tried to shake it off, ate my now cold food, and went upstairs. Before going to bed, I texted my friends about what happened. Then I took a melatonin and knocked out. But in the middle of the night, something woke me. My phone was blowing up with messages from an unknown number. It took me a second, but I realized it was Sophia. She was begging me to talk, apologizing, asking if she could see me tomorrow. Then, message after message. Are you awake? Wake up. Wake up. She had sent wake up 8 times. I replied, why are you up right now? This is crazy. Please just leave me alone. Seconds after pressing send, I heard a scream from inside my closet. No! The closet door burst open. It was Sophia. She had been hiding in my room the entire time. I bolted out of bed and ran for the door. Just as I got it open, she lunged at me, wielding a knife. I barely managed to slam the door shut and hold it closed. She started stabbing the door, screaming. I saw the knife piercing through. Panicked, I yelled something that makes me sick to even remember. Baby, I love you. Please stop. Her breathing slowed. That's all I wanted to hear, she said. Why couldn't you just be honest with me? I told her I was scared and begged her to put the knife down. She agreed and threw it across the room. The moment I heard the knife hit the floor, I ripped the door open and tackled her. She screamed and fought, but I held her down as I shouted my address to the 911 operator still on the line. Minutes later, cops kicked down my front door and stormed in. They cuffed her as she sobbed hysterically. She was arrested that night. The legal battle that followed was long and exhausting. Sophia was convicted of serious charges, and she's in prison now. But nothing about this brings me relief. This was someone I once cared about, someone I thought I loved. I was blind to the warning signs. This experience will haunt me forever. And even though I'm sharing it anonymously, it still feels good to finally say it out loud. Stories 4. I don't live a particularly thrilling life, but whenever someone asks me for a scary story, this is the one I always tell. I was 15, about to start my sophomore year of high school. I grew up in a small coastal town, packed with tourists in the summer, but practically abandoned once the season ended. The bars and restaurants shut down, leaving just the locals, the sky, and the water. If you've never experienced the beach in the off-season, I highly recommend it. There's something eerie yet peaceful about it. Our house was on Driftwood Lane, just a block from the shore. Fittingly enough, I knew how to surf because, let's be real, it would have been pretty embarrassing to live on Driftwood Lane and not know how to ride a wave. The beach and boardwalk had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. Even though I don't live in that house anymore, it's still in the family, so it feels like a part of me. That summer, I was training hard for my high school's varsity cross-country team. I was kind of obsessive about staying in shape, even during the off-season. Since the summer heat was brutal, I'd either run early in the morning or late at night, whenever I could avoid melting or dodging tourists. One particular night, I decided to go for a late run. I'd slept in that morning after staying up too late with some friends, so it was my only option. As usual, I didn't bring my phone, too much extra weight. I had an old Garmin watch to track my pace and distance, plus my house keys in my shorts pocket. My parents were fanatical about keeping the house locked, so forgetting my keys was never an option. The boardwalk was my go-to route that night, easy on the legs, steady terrain. A few miles in, I hit that runner's high, zoning out to the rhythmic slap of my sneakers against the wood, the distant crash of the waves. I was completely lost in it, until I heard it, a faint clink. I stopped, instinctively patting my pocket. Empty. My stomach dropped. My keys. I crouched, peering through the gaps between the planks, but it was useless. Pitch black down there. I cursed loudly, frustrated that my run was ruined. My parents would kill me if I came home without those keys. Without thinking, I jumped off the boardwalk and landed in the sand. I gagged immediately. The smell under there was foul, like rotting seaweed and stale beer. Every step kicked up sand and garbage, but I had no choice. I needed those keys. Using the dim backlight from my watch, I searched the area where I thought they had fallen. Nothing, just sand, damp wood, and trash. My frustration turned to unease. Had I misjudged the spot? Climbing back onto the boardwalk, I got an idea. I untied one of my shoelaces, letting it dangle between the planks, marking the spot. That way I could crawl back under and spot it easily. As I stood up, something tugged on the lace, and just like that, it was gone. Not a breeze, not my own movement. Someone had pulled it. I froze, staring at the gap in the wood. My mind raced. Someone was down there, and if they had my shoelace, they probably had my keys too. A sane person would have run home and dealt with it later. But the thought of a stranger holding my house keys, knowing exactly where I lived, made my blood boil. Our address was engraved on the keychain. I couldn't just let some random creep have them. I took a deep breath, swallowed my fear, and jumped back down. The air felt different this time, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I crawled forward cautiously, my watch light barely illuminating the sand ahead. Then I heard it, shuffling, not from one spot, multiple places. I stopped breathing. There was more than one person under there. A cold realization hit me like a freight train. What was I doing? Was I really about to confront some drugged-out stranger under a boardwalk alone? I turned to leave, but before I could crawl out, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed as fingernails dug into my skin. I didn't think, I just reacted, kicked as hard as I could. My foot connected with something solid, and the grip released. I scrambled away, dragging myself through the sand, ignoring the scratches from the rough wood beams. The second I was in the open air, I sprinted home. I didn't stop until I reached my front door, pounding on it frantically. My dad answered, and to say he was pissed would be an understatement. But before he could yell, I blurted out everything: the keys, the shoelace, the people under the boardwalk. My mom, initially furious, turned pale when she saw the scratches on my ankle. My dad didn't hesitate. He called the cops, and by morning we had a locksmith change all the locks. For a few days, things felt normal again. I told myself it was just a weird, messed up night, until, a few mornings later, I woke up to loud knocking at the front door. It was early, too early. I waited, expecting my parents to answer, but they didn't. Annoyed, I got up, threw on a hoodie, and went downstairs. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. Confused, I opened the door slightly, peering outside. The street was empty. No people, no cars. And then, I saw it, sitting on the doormat. A single shoelace. My shoelace. The one from that night. I slammed the door shut. That afternoon, we installed a security system. For weeks, my family lived in quiet fear. But nothing ever happened after that. Even though I don't live in that house anymore, I still can't shake the thought. Some stranger out there still knows where our beach house is, and they wanted me to remember, too. Stories 5. The thing about living in a coastal town during the off-season is that it feels abandoned. The tourists vanish, the storefronts are boarded up, and the boardwalk, the heart of the town in summer, becomes nothing but a hollow skeleton of itself. I liked it that way. It was peaceful. That's why, for as long as I could remember, I'd go for late-night runs when the boardwalk was empty. It was my detox, my way to escape life and everything that came with it. Sometimes you just need to be alone. Tonight was no different. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood. The only lights came from the occasional flickering street lamp, buzzing faintly, casting long, lonely shadows. I was maybe a mile in when I got that feeling, the one where you just know you're not alone. I glanced over my shoulder. A man stood in the distance, not moving, not walking, just standing there on the boardwalk, facing me. I swallowed hard and turned back around, shaking it off. Probably nothing. Maybe just another local out for a late-night walk. But no matter how you try to rationalize it, that's still an eerie sight to see. I kept running, trying to focus on my breathing, the rhythmic slap of my sneakers against the wood. But a few minutes later, the feeling of being watched came back even stronger. My pulse pounded, not from exertion, but from something else. I couldn't shake the urge to look back again. So I did. He was closer, still motionless, still watching. A deep unease settled in my stomach. I picked up the pace, yanking out my one headphone. My breath came quicker, my feet hitting the wood harder. And then, footsteps, not mine. I turned again. He was even closer, but still completely still. How? I didn't hesitate anymore. I broke into a full sprint. But suddenly, the boardwalk didn't feel like an open path. It felt like a trap, stretching too far in both directions. My car was parked at the very end, right by the beach entrance. I just had to make it there. I ran harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I refused to stop. Every few seconds, I turned my head just enough to check. Every single time. He was closer, still standing, still watching. I didn't understand. How was he stopping so quickly? How was he never mid-step when I turned around? I wasn't even looking where I was going anymore, just focused on getting away. Then, finally, the boardwalk exit came into view, and just beyond it, my car. A rush of relief nearly made me choke. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely press the unlock button. When the lights flashed, I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. The key jammed into the ignition, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I backed out so fast the tires skidded. And then I saw him, standing directly in front of my car, right where I had just been. I barely had time to register anything. Just a hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. I didn't hesitate. I wrenched the wheel to the left, nearly spinning out as I sped away. The entire drive home, I didn't care about red lights, about swerving, about anything except getting away. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked everything, doors, windows, anything that could possibly be an entrance. I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've had nightmares about that man, about what his face might have looked like. My mind created its own twisted versions, distorted images of something lurking just beyond my memory. I never ran on the boardwalk in winter again. Story 6. This happened last summer when I was 22. My friends and I had rented the cheapest Airbnb we could find for a weekend at Ravens Cove, a quiet little coastal town. It was our last night there, and we'd spent most of it hanging out on the beach, drinking around a bonfire. Nothing wild, just good vibes. By the time we were wrapping up, most of my friends were ready to crash. I wasn't tired yet, so I decided to take a walk, clear my head, and shake off the buzz before heading back. There's something eerie but peaceful about a boardwalk at night. Everything's still empty, like a forgotten amusement park. I hadn't spent much time by the ocean before, so I was soaking it all in, enjoying the novelty of it. Then I realized I had to pee. Not ideal. I'm not the kind of guy who just goes anywhere. Something my friends love to mock me for, so I needed to find an actual bathroom. Luckily, I spotted one of those old, beat-up public restrooms along the boardwalk. The dim light flickering above the door didn't make it very inviting, but it was my best option. The second I stepped inside, I regretted it. It reeked. A mix of bleach and something awful that the bleach clearly wasn't covering up. I held my breath and went to the farthest stall, determined to make it quick. Then the door creaked open again. I winced. So much for privacy. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They didn't go straight to a stall or a sink, they just wandered, circling. At times, I swore they were coming from multiple directions, like there was more than one person. But I wasn't sure. Then silence. No movement. No cough. No water running. Nothing. Whoever it was had stopped by the sinks. Just standing there. I hurried to finish up, suddenly feeling antsy. I went to push the stall door open. It didn't budge. The latch was fine, but the door would not move. I jiggled the handle, pushed harder. Still stuck. Annoyance turned to unease. That's when the footsteps started again. Closer this time. A sick, twisting feeling settled in my gut. Someone was holding the door shut. I shoved my shoulder against it, but nothing happened. Adrenaline kicked in, and my brain finally caught up. I was trapped. I wasn't about to sit there like an easy target. I took a step back, braced myself, and charged the door. It burst open, and I stumbled out, just in time to see the main door swing shut, like someone had just walked out. But the bathroom was empty. No one by the sinks. No one near the stalls. And yet I knew there had been someone in there. I washed my hands quickly, shaking, ready to get the hell out. But when I grabbed the handle to leave, it wouldn't turn. The door wouldn't open, like it had been locked from the outside. My stomach dropped. This had to be a joke, right? Some kind of prank? But it didn't make sense. My friends didn't even know where I'd gone. And none of them would do something like this anyway. I banged on the door, yelling for whoever was out there to open it. No response. Then, a noise behind me. Movement. In one of the stalls. I whipped around. Nothing. But I knew someone was in there. I checked under the stall doors, no feet. Which meant they were standing on the toilet, watching me, waiting. I didn't have time to think. My pulse was hammering. I spotted a grimy little window near the ceiling, small, but maybe big enough. I scrambled onto the sink beneath it, half expecting it to break under me. The second I shoved the window open and started climbing through, one of the stall doors slammed open. I looked back and locked eyes with a man. Pale skin, way too hairy. He was dressed like a teenager, but there was no way this guy had to be at least 50. I didn't wait to find out more. I threw myself through the window, landing hard on the boardwalk, my knee slamming into the ground. But I didn't stop. I ran. When I was finally a safe distance away, I called the cops. They actually showed up fast, small town and all. But by the time they checked the bathroom, the guy was gone. That part of the boardwalk was dead at night. No security cameras. No open shops. No one around. One of the officers pointed out scratches on the bathroom door handle, like someone had tampered with it. We all came to the same horrifying conclusion. Whoever was in there didn't want me to leave. The cops told me I was smart to escape through the window, and that was that. I had to head home the next morning, so I never got any updates. Honestly, I doubt they even really investigated. Stories 7. I'm sorry in advance if I mess up some details, but this happened when I was really young. I don't remember exactly how old I was, maybe 8 or 9, but I know it was during one of those summers my family spent at my grandparents' beach house in Harbor Point. That place was like the family hub. Every summer, a mix of siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles would pile in, staying for weekends or even weeks at a time. It wasn't fancy, but it had a ridiculous number of bedrooms, enough to sleep the whole family easily. Plus, it was right near the beach. I'd spend entire days playing in the sand or riding my bike around the neighborhood. It was the kind of childhood that feels like a fever dream now, something distant and unreal as I get older. But that summer was different. A huge hurricane had been forecasted, and the whole town had been preparing for months. One of the ways they tried to protect the shore was by building massive sand dunes as barriers. Calling them dunes doesn't even do them justice. They were like castle walls, stretching along the entire beach. I bet if you saw them from above, the coastline would have looked completely transformed. For my siblings and me, they became our new playground. We'd spend hours climbing them, sliding down, pretending we were on some kind of adventure. But they also did something strange to the beach. Normally, when you stood on the boardwalk, you could see the ocean stretching out in front of you. Now, all you could see was a massive wall of sand. It felt unnatural, like the ocean had disappeared. Another weird thing, the beach had new rules. Lifeguards left at a certain time, and after that, it was technically off limits. Not that it stopped us locals. Our town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Letting kids roam free wasn't a big deal. As long as we promised not to go in the water, our parents didn't really care. And I was a little troublemaker. I liked pushing boundaries, especially when I thought I could get away with it. That's what led me to sneak out that evening. It wasn't even dark yet. The sun hadn't started setting, but I hadn't asked permission. I just wanted some alone time. I think I'd gotten into a fight with one of my brothers, but I don't really remember. Our grandparents' house had a sliding door downstairs where all the kids' bedrooms were, making it stupidly easy to slip out unnoticed. My older cousins had basically written the playbook on sneaking in and out, though their reasons were usually way more rebellious than mine. So, barefoot and quiet, I stepped outside. I headed toward the boardwalk, expecting to see some locals, maybe even kids my age. Even after beach hours, there were usually people around, anyone staying in the houses nearby. But that night, nothing. The whole place felt deserted. At first, I brushed it off, kept walking, figuring I'd run into someone eventually. But the further I went, the weirder it felt. Not a single soul outside. No voices, no distant music from a party, not even the sound of a dog barking. Then I noticed it, a thin trail of smoke rising from behind one of the dunes. First, I thought it was just fog. But no, this was definitely smoke, the kind that came from a fire. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Sometimes tourists lit bonfires, even though it was technically against beach rules. But something about how empty everything was that night made it feel wrong. It reminded me of a volcano, smoke just rising from the sand. I looked around, half expecting to see an adult, someone who could check it out. But there was no one, just me. I should have gone home, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the dune, choosing a spot a little ways away from the smoke. By the time I reached the top, I was covered in sand, and then I saw it. A bonfire, burning in the middle of an empty beach. No people, no chairs, no coolers, no footprints around it. Just a fire burning all by itself. Something about it made my stomach knot up. Even as a kid, I knew leaving a fire unattended was dangerous. I slid down the dune and approached it cautiously. For a second, I just stood there, staring. Then, I started kicking sand onto it, trying to smother the flames, over and over until the fire was finally out. But I didn't leave right away. I was too curious. Why would someone light a fire and then just leave? I poked around the ashes with a stick. That's when I found them. Clothes. Little kids' clothes. Half buried in the sand. Tiny shoes, socks, scraps of fabric. My stomach turned. Then, I saw what else had been burning. Photographs. Most were burned beyond recognition, but one had survived just enough. A boy, probably my age. And the weirdest part? He looked like me. Like, if someone told me he was a cousin I'd never met, I would have believed them. A cold, sick feeling crawled up my spine. I wanted to run. But then, a voice. Hey! I whipped my head up. A man was coming toward me from further down the beach. Bald, staggering like he could barely keep his balance. Drunk or worse. Hey, kid! He called, picking up his pace. I froze. Couldn't move, couldn't think. Don't you go anywhere, he shouted, and that snapped me out of it. I turned and ran. The sand made it hard to move, but I scrambled up the dune as fast as I could. Behind me he was yelling, cursing. Then, fingernails, clawing at my ankle. By some miracle, he never got a grip. I threw myself over the top of the dune, tumbling down the other side. I didn't stop. I sprinted to the boardwalk, then all the way home. I kept looking back, making sure he wasn't following me. He wasn't, but I didn't stop running. I ran straight to my room and cried. I wanted to tell my parents. I really did, but all I could think about was how I'd snuck out, how much trouble I'd be in. So I kept my mouth shut. Nothing ever came of it. No cops at the beach the next day. No news reports. No missing kids. Nothing. To this day, I still don't know what to make of it. But sometimes I think about that photograph and how much that boy looked like me. Stories 8. This happened not too long ago, and it's stuck with me ever since. I've been driving for SwiftRide for a while now, mostly during the late night hours. The streets are quieter and the tips are better, but every now and then, you get a ride that makes you rethink everything. I like to think of myself as careful. I've had my fair share of odd passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what happened that night. Started off like any other shift. I was cruising through the streets of Riverside, my old but reliable 2006 Honda Accord humming along. Around 2:30 a.m., a request popped up from a 24/7 mart a few blocks away. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I drove toward the pickup spot, I got this weird feeling in my gut. The kind you can't explain, but it tells you something is off. As I pulled up, I realized why. The convenience store was closed. The neon open sign was dark, and the parking lot was completely empty. No other cars. No workers inside. Just one guy pacing outside under the flickering streetlight. Even from a distance, I could tell something wasn't right. He wore a hoodie that had definitely seen better days. Frayed sleeves, stains, even a hole near the wrist. His movements were twitchy, like he couldn't stand still, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, paranoid. I should have just driven away. I even hovered my thumb over the cancel button. But for whatever reason, I didn't. The second I unlocked the doors, he slid into the back seat without a word. I regretted it immediately. Most passengers either scroll on their phones or stare out the window. Not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror. Not blinking, not looking away, just staring. I tried to act normal, turned on the radio to break the tension. The second the music started playing, he snapped at me. Turn it off. His voice was raspy, rough. I could tell he was a heavy smoker. I gripped the wheel tighter and did as he said. The silence that followed was unbearable. I hoped he'd just sit there quietly until we reached his destination. But then he spoke. You ever pick up someone you shouldn't have? The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I forced out a laugh and said, well, I hope not, trying to keep things light. He didn't laugh. Instead, he muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make it out, but I got the feeling I didn't want to. Then he started rambling. Said he used to be a rideshare driver too. Claimed he quit after some punks robbed him and trashed his car. His words were slurred, like he was either drunk or high, But one thing stood out: he was grinning the whole time he talked, like he enjoyed the memory. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." I felt my pulse speed up. At this point, I wasn't just uneasy, I was scared. I kept my eyes glued to the road, focusing on the GPS, silently willing the ride to be over. But he wasn't done talking. He started apologizing to someone, not me, just muttering, "I didn't mean it," over and over, his voice shaking. We were less than 5 minutes from the drop-off when he suddenly snapped out of it. "You missed my turn." I hadn't. The GPS showed we were on track. But I slammed on the brakes anyway, out of fear. His voice changed. He demanded I pull over. I didn't argue. My hands were shaking as I shifted into park. And then headlights. A police car was creeping down the road behind us, its spotlight sweeping over my car. The guy in my back seat went dead silent. I turned slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. He had slouched down, nearly flat across the seat, like he was trying to disappear. I knew then, this guy was running from something. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly sat up and looked at me. His eyes were dead serious. "You got lucky." Then, without another word, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. I ended my shift early. I was too shaken to keep driving. A few weeks later, I came across a news article that made my stomach drop. A 24/7 mart had been robbed that same night, 2 blocks from where I had picked him up. I was inches away from a criminal, from someone dangerous. I thought about calling the police, but I have my own reasons for avoiding law enforcement. Even if I did report it, what could they do? All I know is, after that night, I installed a dash cam, and I never ignore my gut feeling anymore. Stories 9. I never thought I'd end up living in the middle of nowhere. The city was where I belonged. Bright lights, constant movement, people always around. But after a traumatic event that I won't get into, I developed a severe sensitivity to noise. My psychiatrist called it phonophobia. Every loud sound, every sudden noise sent a jolt straight to my chest, like my body was bracing for something that wasn't coming. Car horns, slamming doors, even a phone ringing. It all felt unbearable. So, about 3 years ago, I found a secluded cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I won't say exactly where, but it was remote. No traffic, barely any cell service, just pure silence. It seemed perfect. I thought, for the first time in months, maybe I could finally breathe again. The cabin itself was small but solid. Thick wooden beams, a sturdy stone fireplace. It smelled like pine and old books when I first stepped inside. Earthy, almost comforting. The nearest neighbor was about a 10-minute walk down a winding dirt path. I didn't meet them right away. For the first few days, I just soaked in the quiet. Then, about a week in, there was a knock at the door. Startled me. There was no doorbell, so I'd have to get used to that. I opened it to find an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with piercing green eyes and long, silver-streaked hair. She introduced herself as Evelyn and said she lived down the trail. She held out a basket of preserves, practically shoving it into my hands before I could even react. Her presence unsettled me, but not in an obvious way. She wasn't unfriendly, just off. As I hesitated, she said something I'll never forget. "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." Felt less like advice and more like a warning. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. It was rare for the region, but not unheard of. I lit a few candles, curled up with a book, and tried to enjoy the sound of rain against the roof. But a few hours in, there was a loud banging at the door. Not knocking, banging. Heart pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked through the window. Evelyn stood outside, drenched, clutching her own flashlight. Before I could even speak, she blurted, "I saw someone near your woodpile. Thought you should know." My stomach dropped. I stepped onto the porch, shining my light into the rain, but saw nothing, just trees swaying in the storm. I asked if she was sure. She nodded, glancing at the woods like she expected someone to step out at any second. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back into the storm. As soon as I shut the door, something clicked. How could she have seen someone by my woodpile from her house if it was 10 minutes away? She must have already been on my property. That night I barely slept, but at some point after midnight, I woke to the distinct sound of a branch snapping just outside my bedroom window. My breath hitched. Slowly, I crept to the window and peered out. First, nothing. Then I saw her, Evelyn, standing at the edge of the trees, half turned away from my cabin. Her silver hair clung to her face, wild and tangled. I ducked before she could see me watching. When I dared to peek again, she was gone. I stayed awake until dawn, running over every possibility in my head. If she was lying about the intruder, then why warn me? And if she was telling the truth, then someone had been outside my cabin. A few hours passed, and I started to convince myself I'd imagined things, until there was another knock at the door. This time it was quiet. I crept over and peeked through the window. It wasn't Evelyn. A burly man stood on my porch, bald, thick beard, hands shoved into his coat pockets. My stomach turned. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. I backed away, locked myself in the bathroom, and called the police. While I was on the phone, the quiet knocking turned into violent banging. Something heavy slammed against the door again and again. The operator told me help was on the way. Then, with a final, deafening crash, the front door broke open. I bit my lip to keep from making a sound. The man stormed into my cabin, smashing things, breaking glass, tearing through the place. But he never came down the hall. He never tried to open the bathroom door. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and then silence. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They did a half-hearted search of the area but refused to go into the woods, saying it was too dense. I begged them to check Evelyn's cabin. They agreed. When we reached it, my stomach dropped. The place was abandoned. No furniture, no personal belongings. The officers insisted no one had lived there in decades. I argued. I told them I'd seen her, spoken to her, that she'd been at my house just last night. They dismissed it, saying maybe someone had been squatting there, but there was no sign of recent habitation. Then they left, telling me that living in the woods came with risks. I packed up and left the next day. I've told this story to a few people, and everyone has their own theory. Some say Evelyn was never real, that she was a ghost, a warning, trying to protect me. Others think she and the man were both squatters, and for whatever reason, she wanted me out before he could do something worse. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. If Evelyn hadn't knocked on my door that night, I wouldn't have been on high alert. And if I hadn't been on high alert, I might not be here to tell this story. Stories 10. My name is Jake, and my girlfriend, Emily, and I have been together for 3 years. We met during our freshman year at Duke University, a school I dreamed of attending since I was a kid. Neither of us are from North Carolina, we're both from Pennsylvania. She's from Pittsburgh, and I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. Maybe that's why we clicked so quickly. Something about being from the same part of the country made us gravitate toward each other. One of our traditions is how we split Christmas between our families. Emily's become a holiday staple in my house, and my family practically expects her at this point. Since her parents live only a 2-hour drive from mine, we decided early on that we'd spend Christmas Eve with my family and then drive through the night to her house for Christmas Day. Oddly enough, that late-night drive has become my favorite part of the holiday. It's peaceful, just empty roads, quiet fields, and the occasional farmhouse glowing in the distance. We rarely see other cars, and it always feels like the world is asleep except for us. And without fail, we blast Juice WRLD the entire time. His music has been our thing since we met, and even if some people find it cringy, singing along together always feels special. This past Christmas Eve, everything started out like normal. After a great night with my family, we packed up my car around midnight and hit the road. Snow was falling lightly, and the roads were as deserted as ever. The music was on, the heater was cranked up, and everything felt perfect. And then my phone rang. I glanced down, a little annoyed. It was an unknown number. I ignored it without much thought. Probably just a scam call. Emily made a joke about how persistent telemarketers must be to call on Christmas, and I laughed it off. A few minutes later, it rang again. Same unknown number. I sighed but let it go to voicemail. Emily looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "That's weird," she muttered. I shrugged and tried to push it out of my mind, but before I could, the phone rang a third time. Now I was pissed. I grabbed the phone and answered aggressively, ready to tell whoever it was to stop calling. "Hello," I barked. Silence. I turned down the music and listened closely. There was static on the other end. And then, a voice. A man's voice. "Hello, Jake." I nearly swerved off the road. My whole body started to itch, a reaction I always get when I'm anxious. I was too stunned to respond. Then, the man started listing off personal details. My full name, my address, things that no stranger could possibly know. I felt like I was in a trance. I wanted to pull over, but I just kept driving. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Finally, I found my voice and asked him what he wanted. He paused. Then he said, "I'm not here for you. I'm here for Emily." Hearing my girlfriend's name made my blood run cold. I turned to look at her, and the horror in her expression told me she was just as shocked as I was. I stammered, "You have the wrong number. I don't know an Emily." The man chuckled. "She's sitting right next to you." I slammed the brakes and pulled onto the side of the road. Before I could say another word, Emily snatched the phone from my lap and hung up. I turned on her, my voice sharp with panic. "Why did you do that? We needed to know who he was." She just stared at me, eyes wide with fear. I tried calling the number back. Once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt failed. Emily whispered, "Just keep driving." So I did. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't turn the music back on. I couldn't stop thinking about that call. Who was that man? How did he know so much about me? Only our families knew we were on the road that night, and I was certain none of them would pull something like this. When we finally reached Emily's house, I still felt uneasy. It's been almost a month since that night, and I still don't have answers. Neither of our families were responsible. We asked all of them. Emily insists she doesn't know anything, but I can't shake the feeling that